This holiday season, Western Outdoor News is offering some incredible subscription deals to fill those stockings. We're currently offering one of our best discounts of the year on a full year subscription to Western Outdoor News, and we've sweetened the offer for our very popular buy one, give one deal. The deal this year, buy one subscription or renewal for yourself for a discounted price of $39.95 and give up to 5 friends or family members 1 year subscriptions for the insanely low price of $15 each. That means that you can give the gift of Western Outdoor News for an entire year for only $1.25 per month. To claim this deal, head to wonews.com under the subscriptions tab or call 818-286-3108.
There's so much you can get into reading the surf, but the biggest thing, when you're starting out, cast where it's different. Just look where it's different, take guesses. That's the biggest, most important takeaway.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us for another week here at the Western Outdoor News Podcast. As you can tell from this week's episode title, we're doing a deep dive on all things surf perch. I'm joined by acclaimed surf fishermen Ben Hervey-Murray and Nick Heid. We talk about their specific techniques and we answer a handful of reader questions that were submitted from listeners of the show. Before we get to the roundtable discussion, let's jump through some of this week's top stories straight out of Western Outdoor News. So you've got your issue of Western Outdoor News. You've got it in your mailbox or at your local tackle shop. The cover of this week's issue features Clara Reicheball. She's posing with a nice strap of ducks this past weekend after a morning hunt at a club near Colusa, California. This is a really timely photo considering there's now been consistent waterfowl hunting happening in both southern and northern California. Western Outdoor News contributor Jim Nemec offers a full rundown across the most popular regions for waterfowling in this week's issue that you won't want to miss. So looking north at the Chetco River, we are seeing the high water levels. Yep, you heard that right. I said for once, actually high water levels are bringing steelhead into Oregon rivers. What tends to happen here in the southern Oregon region is that when we get a huge rain in December, like we did this year, the steelhead arrive a little bit earlier than their usual January and February season. So we've got tons of photos and everything in this week's issue. Moving down to Southern California, and not necessarily a hunting or a fishing report, but the Longfin tackle shop in Orange, California was hit by one of these horrible smash and grab break-ins that have been plaguing the West Coast. The two thieves stole over $30,000 in high-end fishing reels. At 5:30 a.m. on Friday, December 9th, they were driving a black BMW with stolen plates. There's photos from the theft in this week's issue. Please take a look, and if you have any information that would help this investigation, please call Detective T. Ray of the Orange Police Department at 714-744-7316. With all the shipping issues happening right now, this is just wrong on so many levels. So keep an eye out for these items, and any information that you have would help tremendously. So let's get back to some fishing news. Sticking with our theme of surf perch fishing, if today's conversation just simply isn't enough coverage on the topic, Ben, who you'll hear on the roundtable, wrote a really easy-to-follow article titled 5 Tips to Catch More Perch This Winter. You've really got to read tips number 4 and 5. They touch on rigging mistakes that will cost you and tips on how to use sand clams when scouting for surf perch. Those tips you won't want to miss, but for now, let's jump into our conversation about winter surf perch fishing with Ben Hervey-Murray and Nick Heid. All right, so we're talking surf perch today, and I'm here with Western Outdoor News editor Ben Hervey-Murray and Nick Heid. Both of you guys are producing some excellent pieces for Western Outdoor News about surf perch and surf fishing in general. But today we're gonna rein it in a little bit and just talk about surf perch. So let's start with Ben. Kind of what makes you tick when it comes to surf perch? Why are you targeting this species?
Well, I think first of all, it's an excellent seasonal choice around this time of year. Really, for me, the kind of more summer orientated species like your corbina, the sharky stuff, that tends to sort of finish around Thanksgiving. So really now my kind of time's thinking, my fishing brain is thinking more towards surf perch the next 3 or 4 or 5 months. Where I live in Orange County, we're going to have hopefully a really nice influx of big barred surf perch, particularly in the new year in the spring, as those big females come down to spawn and give birth. And so that's really my interest. Is I think they're a great winter species. They're willing feeders, whatever the water temperature. They're hard fighting. They live in some interesting places. They've got some interesting quirks. So from my perspective, I think they're a great species to fish for during the winter. They kind of require a few different things to what I'm used to doing in the summer, maybe fishing with lighter line and so on. And they're just fun fish. They're just willing fighters, willing feeders all year round, but particularly in these winter months. And for me, they're just a great species. I love fishing for them. I love that process of working them out, spending a couple of hours on a beach and just finding that little pod of fish and just having a really busy kind of hour or two when you do that. So yeah, they're great fish. Really pretty fish as well. A lot of people like eating them for tacos, so I know that's a big attraction for people. And they're just a cool fish, a really interesting species. So that's it for me, really, just a fascinating winter species.
Okay. And then how about you, Nick?
A lot of my kind of draw to them, it can be really closely correlated to what Ben's talking about. I think the biggest thing for me is that you got the summertime species, like he said, and really surf perch and halibut go in as well to really kind of just round off the versatility of SoCal year-round surf fishing. Because without the surf perch, it would be a super just tough time going year-round fishing because they're a huge part of everything aside from summer. And I think I wrote an article a while back about kind of how I used to not understand the hype about surf fishing for surf perch. And as soon as I switched up from only being a summertime surf fisherman to fishing the colder months, I kind of realized like, okay, these things can get big. These things can put up a fight. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So let's kind of do a little primer here. Let's start at the beginning. One of the barrier to entries for any kind of surf fisherman, if you haven't done it in the past, is gear selection. So let's talk specifically about surf perch, and let's go one by one, or just have a conversation here about gear selection, rod, reel, your line weight. How are you targeting this species?
You can go for it, Ben.
Oh, thank you, Nick. Well, obviously, my tactics are a bit more orientated towards the lighter line stuff. So I think this is a good question to ask, really, because no doubt Nick, I think, is probably going to go for some slightly heavier, maybe lure orientated combination setups. Whereas my fishing, definitely with my clients, maybe more of the beginner and younger clients, very much orientated towards the smaller kind of medium-sized fish, hopefully with an outsized chance for big ones. So my combo really for surf perch fishing, and I've used this up and down the coast, all the way up to right at the northern counties of California, all the way down south, is I like a 9-foot surf rod. So actually I've got a 9.6 at the moment, and I really like those because it gives you a bit of extra ability to lift that line, particularly when you're fishing with a light sea rig. Just pop that line off the top of the wave, stops it getting dragged off down the current a little bit, and it gives you a lot more control, I feel, over the rig when you're particularly when you're closer in. You have those kind of like 6-7 foot real short kind of like trout rods I see a lot of people use. I don't really feel that's that really helps you getting that kind of line, lifting that line off the water, feeling the bite, hitting that bite, staying in control of the fish, particularly the perch. They're quite a kind of slab-sided fish, so they're going to kind of go wash towards you on the fight, and with that wave and so on and the current. So having that longer rod really helps you control the rig, the fish, helps you cast a little further as well. So there's a few reasons for that longer rod. I like to pair that with about a 2500 size reel, so a little spinning reel. At the moment, I'm using a little Shimano Sahara, just $100 spinning reel, beautifully smooth, lovely smooth drag. I've got that loaded with 10-pound braid. On top of the 10-pound braid, I've got a little short mono top shot. So in the summer, I use 8-pound fluorocarbon top shot. In the winter, that's going to be 10 pounds. And at the end of that, I've got a little, usually 3/4 ounce. In the summer, very, very calm, go down to 1/2 ounce. If in winter, very, very rough, maybe go up to 1.5 ounces. But really a little egg sinker with a little see-through bead, tiny little swivel, and then my end tackle is usually 6 or 8 pound fluorocarbon for perch in the winter with a little size. If I'm fishing with a grub, it's going to be a size 2 or 4, little J hook, little Owner Mosquito light hook. And in the summer, it's maybe more sand crabs orientated, so little, even smaller hooks, so maybe a size 8 or 6. So that's it really, really simple. Basic Carolina rig, 9-foot surf for a 2500 size reel, £10 braid. Braid's very important. I don't like fishing with thick mono, particularly more finesse style like this. So that's it really, pretty simple. And that, I like it simple. My combos are kind of $200-300. So really for $200, you get yourself kitted out with a very nice combo, as I've just described.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then how about you, Nick? And similar setup, or do you have something unique?
I mean, you could say similar, you could say different. I kind of actually use the same setup I use for Corbina, Croaker, all the summertime stuff. If I'm doing the Carolina rig style. So I'll go, my current setup is an 8.6 Okuma Solilo. It's going to be medium action. I think I'd have to look at it again, but I think it throws something like a quarter to 5/8 or something. I could be totally wrong. But it's 8.6 medium action. The reel is going to be a Penn Battle. And this is where I differ from Ben. I go 4,000. And I like 15-pound tests, and I'll just use straight mono. No problems with it. I do go to a fluorocarbon leader, but I stick with 15-pound test there. And my hooks, Ben, what size hook did you say you use?
Well, I really like for if I'm fishing in the winter with little grubs, I like a size 2 or 4 own mosquito, but that's really specifically fishing with a little 2-inch. I mean, the Berkeley Gulp sandworms are obviously very popular, and there's a few other companies that make the little grubs, but really that's for a 2-inch kind of sandworm style grub, or you get those little paddle tails, the little motor oil paddle tails I like as well. So that's a very specific hook for those, really.
Okay, yeah. So I'll use, if I'm using muscle meat, which is usually my go-to in the wintertime, I'm going to use a size 2 because it's tough to get the muscle meat on a size 4, especially if you're not dexterous with your fingers and you're a newbie. Size 4 is going to hook everything. It's just a matter of what's easiest for the bait in that respect. And I know it's kind of weighing in what's best for the fish, what's going to really keep your bait on the most, because if you don't have bait, you don't have fish. And that's kind of my setup there. I'll use a 1 ounce weight, about 2 to 2.5 feet for the leader. And that's going to be my typical surf perch setup. But if I'm doing the lures, I'm going to switch that setup up. And that's going to be typically Lucky Craft for the surf perch. I just actually got a new setup for my lure setup, and I've completely fallen in love with it. I'm doing, it's another Okuma. It's the Okuma SST, and it's a 9-foot. It's actually heavy. And the reason for that is because I've started to kind of have a desire to target a different whole class of fish, like going for that really big halibut, calico, and possibly white sea bass. That's a whole nother story, but I like that setup to be versatile enough to handle both any lure fishing from the surf. And that I've paired with a 4,500 spin fisher, and I'm doing 20-pound braid. So that's kind of the story on that.
Okay. So this is the first time anybody's mentioned braid. So what's the take on the braid versus mono versus fluorocarbon? How would that affect the fishing technique for surf perch?
Well, so for me, the only reason I use braid in terms of lure fishing is really going to be to fit more line on there. And I don't even use a top shot or quick leader there. So I'm just there for the added line capacity. The sensitivity really isn't huge to me. And especially because a lot of the times I'm getting those lures stuck on rocks, because I've said it before. When I throw lures, I throw it where I think I might lose it. And I know it sucks with a $20 lure, but that's going to be your best bet. And in my experience, mono actually kind of helps helps you not lose as many lures, because when you do kind of try to get that lure off the rock, it kind of has that little extra bend in the line, and that can actually help save a few lures. But the braid is strictly there for me to fit some more line on there for the bigger class fish.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Ben? Where do you stand on braid versus the mono versus fluoro?
Well, I think it was interesting to see Nick talk about the mono in relation to using the Lucky Craft, because I had an interesting discussion with a couple of the bass guys in the office this week, and it was their opinion of bass fishing, specifically freshwater bass fishing, was that a lot of the real pro guys do really prefer using like a mono or a fluorocarbon for their lures, particularly the hard bait, like the lipped crankbait kind of things, because it helps them dive down. It really helps the action. There was kind of quite a few factors that really lent itself to using that mono. So I think that's interesting that Nick's also found the same thing in saltwater whilst targeting the, like you said, the white sea bass and the halibut and so on. But I personally, I'm a big braid main line guy. The combo I was just mentioning earlier about the surf perch, I always have 10-pound 8-strand braid. So real kind of fine. I use one of those kind of brands of braid that's meant to be slicker than the average braid. So it casts really nicely. And I think that just works really well in the surf because I'm trying to use as really a lighter sinker as possible, trying to add to the finesse of the whole setup. And using braid really helps with that. We all know about the complete lack of stretch with braid, which really helps with bite detection. So, there's little surf perch bites, there's little taps. I think the earliest you can hit that, the less chance you've got of deep hooking the fish and also actually hooking the fish, because I think once they've had a couple of little taps at it and they've worked out it isn't a real worm, they're going to be off very quickly. So the earlier you can feel that bite and hit that bite directly, which is something braid is very good at, the better really. So I'm a big braid mainline guy. Like I said, 10-pound braid all the way through for my surf perch rigs. But having said that, all the way through means really to the top shot. So I'm going to got, my reel full of obviously 10-pound braid, and then probably about 10, 12 feet of 10-pound mono in the winter, 8-pound fluorocarbon in the summer. And really the only difference is because I think perch personally are a lot less particular about things they want to eat and things that are considered to be maybe a bit wrong in the water. Whereas a corbina, for example, which is something we also catch when doing some of the surf perch fishing, definitely at the kind of beginning and end of the season where there's a crossover between the two species. I like the fluorocarbon. I like the lack of visibility in the fluorocarbon, but I'm not such a big fan of the lack of stretch, or not lack of stretch, but it doesn't have as much stretch as mono. It's not quite as good, not strength as mono. So in the winter, I'm going to go for 10-pound mono top shot with the 10-pound braid. And my leader in that situation is going to be either 8 or 6-pound fluorocarbon, possibly 4-pound fluorocarbon if I was maybe fishing with a really experienced angler or just wanted to have a bit of fun myself. But yeah, so I'm a big braid mainland guy, but I'm also using that for bait and weights or kind of trundling those kind of grubs or moving those grubs around. So I'm doing a slightly different style of fishing to Nick, which lends itself more to braid, whereas I think Nick's style of fishing, as he described very well there, lends itself much more to a mono mainline. Also, that's going to be more economical. So if you're getting lures hung up on rocks and so on, you really want that mono to be taking that abuse. And, you can change it out pretty quickly or chop off 10 meters and not be too upset about it. Whereas if you did that with your really fancy, nice J braid or your Power Pro, you might, after 3 or 4 sessions of that, you might be looking at your reel and thinking, that's cost me quite a lot of money.
Yeah.
So I want to clarify a couple points, because Ben made a really good point about the stretch and going back off me with getting stuck in rocks. I've fished both with braid and with mono, doing the Lucky Craft style for surf perch, and I'm kind of in a transition right now as I'm experimenting with the bigger fish. But for the most part, I've actually used mono for a lot of my surf perch fishing for the Lucky Craft, and I think, Ben really hit it on the nail on the head there, because that stretch not only helps you to avoid losing lures, but what I've found with surf perch and Lucky Craft, you're not setting the hook at all when you get bit with these. Whereas what Ben was talking about with the Carolina rig, you need that quick hook set. You need to act when the fish hits. Now, there is a waiting period, but with Lucky Craft, you've seen the troubles on these things. If they get one hook, you're best off letting the Lucky Craft swim a little bit and hook them again. So I think it's huge there, and I'm going to kind of have to weigh which method I'm going to stick with, but I'm trying both braid and mono right now.
Okay. Yeah, that'll be an interesting kind of case study and see how that works out.
I'd like to read that article, Nick, when you I think
I'll send it over.
Yeah, there'll be some interesting things in it, I'm sure. So,
Okay, so let's back up a little bit, and this is a super beginner question, but if somebody has never done this before and they walk onto the beach and they don't necessarily know what to look for, where should I even start casting? What would be the first thing to tell them to look for in the water, whether it's currents or rock formations or structure? What should people be looking for as they approach the beach, maybe from a beginner perspective?
Ben, do you want to take it? Do you want to make an order for this?
Yeah.
I don't want to jump in there when I'm not supposed to.
Because the article actually, which I've written in the current issue of Western Outdoor News, actually addresses this directly. So maybe this is useful for me to go first, but obviously Nick's going to have a different perspective.
Go for it.
But from my perspective, and pretty much the first thing in this article that I've written is the thing that I've seen a lot with my clients when I've been guiding, and that is that the main feature that you're going to look for surf perch is that kind of inner lip. So if you go to a beach, say an hour or two before or after high tide, there's going to be just where the kind of water turns over, usually kind of a meter or two back from where you can comfortably stand, there's going to be this kind of little drop off, and it can be anything from like 2 inches to a foot or 2 foot. And often if you see surfers walk out, you'll see them kind of, my first meter or two, it'd be like ankle deep just in the shore break. And then they'll drop down to kind of knee deep. And that's a kind of really significant feature for me, because that's frankly where I catch probably 80-90% of the perch that I find. And also they really like fish. They really like that feature for, this holds a lot of the food as well. Those little, particularly the overwintering sand crabs, they're going to be dug deep into that lip feature, kind of popping out occasionally. There's also going to be the sand clams, and again in the article we talk about the importance of sand clams in the winter. So there's going to be those food sources right there. It's going to have the turnover of food, so it's got a readily available, constantly changing kind of conveyor belt of food. The surf perch is very, very happy to sit and live and feed and eat in that very unpleasant environment of kind of really a foot or two of shore break. So, most people will probably be trying to cast really far. Okay, great. If you want to catch a halibut or maybe even the bigger grade of perch that's sat slightly back, but if you're a beginner and you just want to catch like a load of perch, if you want to have that kind of 10, 20 fish a day with your kids, honestly, look at that. Just look at that bit right under your feet almost. And I love it because when I show a client there and they catch a fish from somewhere that looks so ridiculous that they'd never even think of fishing there, when they do actually catch the fish there, there's always a bit of a joking moment of, wow, they really do live there. And I like that. That means that on their next session, when they next go to the beach, they're going to be kind of have that same little bit of knowledge, and they're going to be probably fishing where nobody else is fishing, but probably catching twice as many fish. So if I was a beginner doing that, fishing with a little grub or a sand crab or a bit of mussel meat, I'd be looking at that right.
So the big takeaway there is, hey, maybe don't cast as far as you possibly can. Yeah. Maybe just look straight down at your feet sometimes.
I mean, the caveat to that is do cast, because they might be a little further back. You might find a little pod of fish, particularly when the tide starts to spill out a little bit when you're sort of approaching the skinnier water. But if you've really got high tide situation, which is a pretty good time to fish for a lot of general species, particularly the perch, because they'll come in closer, it eliminates, the jeopardy possibly of trying to cast a light rig very far. You could just cast that thing 10 meters, bounce that back into that inshore kind of lip area, wait for something to happen. If you don't get anything, move down the beach 2-3 meters, carry on doing that until you find the fish. And when you find them, you can just underarm that rig straight into that shore break and just catch one after the other. In fact, one of my favorite things to do with clients is to have the target of catching a hat trick. So I want to catch, or them to catch rather, 3 fish in 3 casts, which you can't really do if you're just targeting a giant perch. If you're kind of a kid or you're starting out, it's kind of fun to do. And, catching 3, even if they're little palm-sized ones, those little lovely dinks, that's totally fine. So that's my perspective on that. It's really that inshore, that inner lip, that kind of ridge, and the adjoining kind of trough is probably the most important feature to look for if you're just starting out.
Okay. All right. So you mentioned high tide. Is that a time where people should be approaching the beach as they're targeting surf perch?
Yeah, so I'm really thinking about a shallow kind of sandy beach, or your typical kind of sandy beach, which, slopes up gradually. But at the high tide, you're going to have that scenario where the water's going to be interacting with that kind of lip and that kind of up, that kind of area, which might not be underwater all of the time. And I think, differently from my experience, the perch will come inshore, come really quite close to the beach at that time. So they use that water movement. And actually, one of my favorite times to fish, right, is probably just an hour or two off the high tide. So when that tide is going out, I think the fish use that outgoing water to find food. So all those tiny little centrales, all those little amino acids and the little chemical signatures of those little things feeding, particularly the sand clams and the sand crabs and worms. They're going to be able to sense those in the water. Or they'll have evolved a method of doing that really around the amino acids probably, and they'll be swimming up that tide, up that moving water, and using that moving water to find food. So that for me is the perfect time to fish, just an hour or two off the high tide. But if you can only get there before the high tide, fine. But I'd really be slightly reluctant to fish for the perch at very, very skinny water. Maybe that's more of a summer corbina time, or you still get your halibut there, I'm sure. But for me, that's the best time if you're just starting out. Pick those high tides, and if you within that scope as well, if you pick the slightly larger high tides. So really, my favourite time is when you start to build up to like one of the significant moons, like a full moon, and you start to get those big tides, kind of big high tides at kind of 6, 7 in the morning, or 5, 6, 7 at night. So they coincide with the dawn or dusk. That's the optimum time in my experience. Nice moon cycle, perfect tide, bit of movement on dawn or dusk, and that would be a really good solid day sport.
Okay, so here's our first question that we've gotten from Facebook here. It might depend on the water conditions and the surf coming in, but where do you stand on the beach while you're actually surf fishing for surf perch? Are you standing in the water, up on shore? Where exactly do you actually stand while you're fishing for surf perch? Nick, let's start with you.
All right, so with that, I think even going back to the first question, it really depends where the structure is, in my opinion. I don't typically have to fish a certain tide, whether it's rising or falling. I like to fish a certain level of the tide that submerges certain structure in the right way. So for instance, with Lucky Craft, I'm typically looking for hard structure, like rocks, sometimes reef, but more so kind of like big, like boulder rocks, like kind of the rocks you'd see on a jetty, but ideally those rocks kind of spread out intermittently with good sandy flats next to them. And the cool part about that is that with using the Lucky Craft to target surf perch that way, you're going to get halibut too, because they're going to like those sandy flats next to the rocks. And the biggest thing there, so sometimes the structure is going to be 40 yards out, and maybe you can cast 40 yards out and you stand on the sand. Sometimes the structure is going to be even closer. You still need to stand on the sand. You're good. Other times, if you're willing to wait out and the structure is just outside of your castable distance from the sand, you're going to have to wait out a little bit. And I do that plenty of times, and that's kind of the mentality I take. I think your goal isn't necessarily to say, okay, I'm always going to stand here, or I'm always going to stand 2 feet into the water. I don't think that's the right mentality. Your goal should be to fish the structure and cast where the structure is.
Okay, and then Ben actually mentioned the other day in the office that it's really good during, especially the super tide that we had the other week, when you have these really low tides. That's their time to find the structure, to go to the beach and find something that you would never be able to see when the water's up higher.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, I actually I'm in a bunch of different groups and whatnot, and there's this Discord server off of some SD Fish forum that it basically created itself. And some guy posted a picture of this really crazy looking spot. It had the most reefy looking section I've ever seen. And I had fishing San Diego all my life. I had never seen that aside from at like Sunset Cliffs or at La Jolla in the tide pools. And I'm like, how have I never seen this? So there was a little bit of an edge of a bluff in there. And I was like, I know that bluff. So I went the next evening because I saw the ultra low tide was at that same tide that the picture was taken at. And I went to the beach that I thought it was, and I found, I think a spot that I'm going to be fishing for my lifetime for sure. So going to the beach on those super, super low tides, anything under like negative 0.7, when you get negative 1, you see some things that you never thought were even in San Diego.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so speaking of, you're talking about San Diego.
It's applicable to anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's kind of get a geographical layout here. Nick, you're primarily surf fishing in San Diego. And then Ben, you're primarily Orange County, LA County area?
Yeah, I do LA County and Orange County. So we've got, me and Nick are pretty much the whole of Southern California covered. All of the major coastal counties. So, and yeah, I do right up to Santa Monica Bay, all around there. In fact, I had some nice walleye perch actually, which was quite unusual up there the other week.
So here's another question, I guess this is on topic. Dylan in the office here, he asked, is Orange County, is it actually worth targeting surf perch in Orange County? And I guess the answer for this would be yes, right, Ben?
Oh, absolutely. They tend to be very, very seasonal because, like I mentioned earlier, in the winter, we definitely get a run of the larger females down here, kind of normally peak culminating in kind of January, February, March, April time, with the absolute peak within that time being kind of March time, I guess, really. But also it's down to water temperature. And this year we've had really cold water. We have this kind of blob of cold water sat off Orange County. And I feel like that has aided the surf perch fishing because I had a couple of clients who had never caught surf perch before. And okay, I was a little dubious about our chances of really finding a couple of big ones, but we did. We did the same tactics we used in the winter. We used the grubs and so on and the combo I mentioned earlier. And they were there. They're home. And it was really due to, I think, that 61, 62 degree water that we seem to have had hanging off our coast. We haven't had the kind of 66, 68 degree water that they don't like. We seem to have this colder water, which they really favour. And I think they just either hung around or they've come down a little extra early from that other colder kind of water they like a bit further up north, around the kind of Santa Barbara County area. And and it's absolutely worth targeting them. I catch multiple really nice barred surf perch. Within that, I'll catch, probably most seasons, I'll catch, a really big one. I think my best last year was 14.5 inches. So on a 4 pound line and a little grub, that's kind of fun. That's fun fishing. But also, I regularly have days where I catch, 10, 20 perch of everything from hand size to kind of, your 11, 12, 13 inch fish. So that to me is a really fun day. So yeah, very, very worth targeting them. Again, I'd be a bit particular about the tides and sort of new fish, just because I don't think there's like thousands and thousands just waiting to be caught. So you have to be a little bit careful, know what you're doing a little bit, but they're here. They're definitely home. You fish particularly the areas where, I think, like Nick mentioned earlier about where the rocks meet the sand and how it's a great spot for halibut, but there's also a great spot for really kind of maybe the smaller surf perch. So if you're looking for a fun day, find those little spots where the rocks meet the surf or the sand and target the little baby surf perch with I think we laid out some tactics really in that issue of Western Outdoor News about, little tricks you can do to skew the odds in your favour, really, of catching all sorts of sizes of perch rather than just the big ones. So that would be my answer to that. Is definitely worth targeting them. Just be a little bit careful about when you fish, because on those big flat sandy beaches we have in Orange County, when that water spills out, you're looking at very, very shallow water. In my experience, they're not coming into that super, super shallow water when the tide's out, but they will come in close when the tide's in.
Got it. Okay, so talking about numbers as well, what's the limit for surf perch?
Yeah, I'll take that one. You got a 10 bag limit, and it's interesting because you've got different species of surf perch. So you've got the walleye, you've got barred surf perch. I don't know, Ben, you don't get any red tail up there, right? That's way past you.
Never actually, Nick.
Okay.
We can talk about the more exotic species as perch after this, maybe, because that's a kind of pet subject of mine.
Yeah. And then do black surf perch fall into the same limit? Do you know, Ben?
I'm not sure, actually. I know, like you said, there is. I mean, for me, it's not really a huge issue because I very rarely take the perch, and if I
absolutely,
like one or two.
I don't take them at all.
Really pay a great deal of attention to, but I know what you just said is from what I understand correct about having the overall bag limit, and I think within that, the main thing for me to be aware of when definitely with the bag limits of perch is that, and you talked about this in that great article you did on November 28th about how they give birth to live babies, and if you have a big female in your perch in your bag and that gives birth in your bag, then that's part of your bag limit. So if she gives birth to 18, 19, 20 babies and you have her in your bag as well, you're pretty over the limit. So I'd be very, very careful about that. And that's also one of the reasons I'm not so keen on keeping them, is that bigger ones tend to be these sort of big pregnant females, and I just think we'll just put it back. Maybe occasionally 10, 11 inch gets cut up for a bit of shark bait in the spring, or when maybe one of my clients takes home a couple of the nice big ones for a bit of taco meat. But I'm never really looking to push that kind of bag limit to its limit. Just I guess it's different fishing down here. I know in the central and northern coast, I see great photos of guys with real nice bags of these huge red-tail perch, big barred as well, big calicos. So I'm sure those guys know exactly what they're doing and their limits and so on. But again, for me, it's not really an issue.
Yeah. So, and with that 10 bag limit, you've actually got the option, as I was talking about multiple species, you get 20 total. So that could be 10 barred, 10 walleye, or you could go into 3 species and say you threw red tail in there and go 7, 7, 6 or something like that. But definitely, I mean, my recommendation is be careful with what you're keeping for the exact reason that Ben talked about with the fry, which are the live young. And also, I think you can keep a much bigger fish and get just the same amount of meat for keeping 6 or 7, maybe even 10 surf perch. So my experience is just not worth it.
Yeah, it ends up being a lot of work.
What's that?
They're just awesome fish, and like the big ones just aren't that common down here. So I'm pretty keen on just putting those back as quickly as possible. Quick photo, put them back respectfully, and for me that's the best way to deal with those ones. And like I said, keep some of the smaller ones maybe if you want some taco meat. But when you get those really big females, to me that's kind of a unique breeding fish, ones people say.
Mm-hmm. So you touched on the exotic surf perch. Let's hear it, Ben. Like what draws you to the species, and what are some of these cool exotic surf perch that you're talking about? Well,
there's about 20 species of surf perch, and there's a really good infographic on the CDFW's website sort of detailing all of them. And they all have very particular characteristics. For example, we have a few walleye surf perch down here, and I've never caught a walleye in one beach, but if I go to another beach, which is only like 3 miles down the road and just happens to have a few more rocks, you'll catch walleyes. So there's some very specific things that they like. And I think understanding those and learning about those is something that I find really interesting. And even more fascinating to me is when you go up north, particularly around like San Francisco, kind of Monterey area, you have things like the rainbow surf perch and things like the blacklist surf perch. And there's some really exotic ones that have very, very particular habitats, very cool looking. On my absolute bucket list is catch a rainbow surf perch. I went up to the Central Coast road trip this summer, totally failed to catch a rainbow, caught a calico, which is one of my bucket lists. So I'm kind of working my way down the species. I've got my shiner, I've got my pile, I've got my obviously my barred and my walleye. So getting calico was cool. And next up, I'm definitely looking to fish on the kind of Central Coast a bit more, get some specimen red tails and something like that. So for me, that's a great thing. It's almost like collecting like Pokemon or something. I want to catch them all. I want to get that list and of all of them and see I want to see a rainbow surf perch definitely. That's my absolute unicorn fish, and that probably gets me more excited than something 20 times the size during the winter. So yeah, that's my perspective on the more exotic species of perch, and I'm super jealous of anybody who lives up in those kind of like rocky reefier areas where they've got those resident, because we just don't have them at all here. We're just walleyes and barred at the moment, with occasional shiner and pile perch in sort of limited areas. But yeah, how about you, Nick? Have you got any exotic species down there, an exotic surf perch?
I know a few people who have, and the zebra surf perch. Have you got one of those?
Oh wow, okay. Yeah, that's I
have not
on the bucket list. That's not even like considered.
Yeah. Okay. So I've the only slightly exotic one I've had is the black surf perch. I get a few walleyes, and exactly what you're talking about. The more rocky beaches have more of them.
They're so local, aren't they? I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, the one thing I found is that they're much tinier in general than barred surf perch. And also they are well named, that's for sure.
Yeah, I tend to find that I have like weeks where I might catch 2 or 3, 4 with them over a couple of sessions, and then I won't see any for like weeks and weeks and weeks.
Yeah, they're definitely less common than the barred surf perch, that's for sure.
Definitely, but I think they're kind of cool. And I mean, if I want to catch one of those, I had a species guy fishing with me this summer, and we used a little tactic actually, which I've outlined in that article I've written. And really, that's using kind of like a thumbnail-sized piece of those gulp sandworms. So I'm cutting up a whole 2-inch sandworm until really there's kind of almost like a kind of 1/4 to 1/2 inch section, and just sliding that onto the hook. So That way the perch has to get the whole thing in its mouth, including the hook, in order to eat it rather than just grabbing the tail. And that's how we catch a lot of the smaller perch. Within that smaller perch, 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 is the walleye, which if you're a species guy is a big deal.
Are you going like tide pools for that? What are you doing?
I'm actually fishing really close into shore. I've got a kind of few beaches where there's these kind of super rocky jetties and kind of other outcrops. And I find that if I just fish in tight into those, and I think they school in with the barred personally. I don't think they have like a separate school. I think probably they're genetically really similar. Maybe they just end up hanging out with the bards because they're in the same place. But I'll catch them alongside the barred perch. We'll catch the walleye, 5 walleye, then a barred. So 5 barred and then a walleye. It's that kind of ratio when they're about. But then I won't see any for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then we caught a really giant one up in Santa Monica Bay the other day. It was probably, I don't know, in the kind of 9-10 inch range, which is the biggest one I've seen. Which is kind of cool because, that's probably a big breeding female. So the more of those about, the more little baby ones it's going to make.
All right. Well, hey, let's jump into, we got 3 more questions. Let's kind of jump into some of these here. So this one is really specific, and you guys might have to explain even to me what this question even means. Quinn on Instagram said, what are your thoughts on adding small bits of orange yarn when using live sand crabs? So what is he talking about here?
So he's referring to the roe, which is the sand crab eggs. I personally, I'd stick with what's natural. I probably wouldn't try to mimic something that, if you've got the live bait, if you've got sand crabs, then use sand crabs. You don't need to add anything to the sand crabs. Ben might have a different take on this, but I personally, if you're using sand crabs, you just use the sand crabs.
Yeah, I completely concur with Nick in that regard. I think the best bait is the natural bait. They sell fly fishing adage of match the hatch. And if you've got a beach and there's a patch of sand crabs in front of you, I'd fish right where those sand crabs are. In fact, the subtlety within that is that often when the tide's coming up and covers up the sand crabs, they're not available for us to go and grab. So maybe a good little tip there is to go and grab your sand crabs before you start fishing, a couple of hours before, and then start fishing when the water comes up, or assuming you're fishing like an incoming tide maybe. But yeah, I'd agree. The best bait absolutely is a completely natural one, a well-presented sand crab. And often I find that a better bait is, rather than trying to slap on 1 or 2 really of the bigger sand crabs, you get these kind of grape-sized ones. I find like a little bunch of like 3 or 4 kind of pea-sized ones of those kind of little, the smaller grade ones is often better. And the way I liken it is you want them to just swallow the whole thing. You don't want them to have to like crush the end, which I find happens if you use a larger sand crab. The smaller to medium-sized perch, crush the end off it. You don't get hooked up, but when you hit the bite, you probably tear the rest of the sand crab off the hook and you miss the bite. Whereas with a kind of 3 or 4 sand crabs and no additions really, no yarn or anything, then that seems to be getting more hookups. But the only thing I'd add to that though is in the winter, I'm always going to fish with a little faceted bead. So a little, by faceted, I mean like one that's got lots of little surfaces to reflect the light. And I use a 3 or 4 mil red faceted bead on my hook leader, so just above the grub all the time in the winter. And I think that really seems to just visually it just catches the eye. And you imagine on the water when it's quite kind of murky, something that just the light bounces off that reflects a colour like the kind of reddy kind of orangey colour, something that reflects back at the fish that kind of creates a little feeding trigger. I think that's really definitely catches me a few extra fish. And I'm fishing them back to back. I've had the opportunity to have one rod without it and one with, and definitely the one with has more attention to pay to it, just because that little visual attraction. So that's probably the only thing is, and during the summer, sand crabs, when the sand crabs are available, I do not use anything on the hook apart from just sand crabs. But if you can find also the ones with the orange roe, like the guy mentioned, then you don't need to use a bit of yarn. So that would be my take on that really. 2 or 3 little sand crabs. Orange roe laden one's great. If you can't find those, not a problem. It's a very, very small difference. I think you're much better off focusing on getting really good high quality bait presented well and the correct size. So not too big, not too small.
Yeah. So I guess in that vein, what are your guys' takes on using scent for the artificial lures in the surf?
Ben, you can take that first.
Oh no, I think this is very much a question for you, Nick.
Okay, all right, sounds good.
Artificials in terms of like hard baits. I mean, definitely the grubs and so on, but I'd And I use the ones soaked in the kind of Berkeley magic juice in the bag they come in. But beyond that, this is very much, I think, a question for you, Nick.
All right. Well, so for the artificials, obviously there's a few different classes of artificials, and when it comes to Lucky Crafts and hard plastics like that, I wouldn't even try to mess with that. I don't even think this question is really applicable to that unless people are doing that. I'm not aware of people putting scent on hard plastics like that. As far as the kind of Berkeley Gulp sandworms go, they're going to be pre-scented, and I stick with that. I've heard of the Bill Varney use some hot sauce. Have you heard of that, Ben?
Yes, I have actually, but I can't think how that would really not. Surely it would just all come off immediately as soon as it hits the water.
Yeah, I would agree there.
Really hot sauce, like a really kind of like sticky kind of gel kind of like stuff. And I'm aware that people use things like there's something called butt juice, which I've seen people use for halibut, and it's kind of like the gel, kind of real stinky gel. So that's probably my only insight into that. Is that's just something I've seen used and presumably works. Otherwise, nobody would use it.
Yeah, I think we got our sound clip of Ben saying "butt juice," butt juice on the podcast here. That's a first.
Wow. Okay.
But hey, I mean, I guess that's insightful because I'm sure a lot of people who live or die by scent. Everybody has a strong take that I've talked to has a strong take about just scent in general. Sometimes you get on a boat with a guy and he's got scent, and other guys say I'd never touch the stuff. So it's interesting that it does start a conversation for sure.
Yeah, but I'd like to put it out there that if you're listening to this and you're into your surf perch and you use scent in any way, I'd love to hear from you. Write into Western Outdoor News, tell us about the tactics, write an article, because I think that's there's probably some really interesting stuff going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think if it's sitting in a stationary place, that's one thing, or scent might affect it. But if you're working it actively, I just have a tough time believing that scent is really going to play a large role when the main idea is that your presentation is what's going to have the biggest effect.
Got it. Okay. So speaking of presentation here, this is another question from Instagram from Mason. He said, what do I look for in the waves to know where to cast when using light tackle? Are there any indicators that you're looking for? And we kind of already addressed this a little bit, but I guess a spin-off of this question would be, are you guys casting straight out from shore or along the shore?
Well, if I do it from a light line perspective, first of all, really what I'm looking for say I'm turning up at the beach and it's a couple of hours off the high tide, I've got a 1 or 2 foot swell, which is, pretty nice, pretty mellow, but just enough water moving to make it keep the fish moving and keep the food moving. So I'm turning up at the beach, and the first thing I'm going to look for is, like I mentioned earlier about that inner lip structure. And but also secondary to that, if I can't find that, or if I'm also looking for some different types of structure, I'm going to then look at where the waves are coming towards me. So I've got that 1 foot wave coming towards me, it's slowly rolling towards me, and it hits a trough and it stops breaking. So if you look at the wave breaking all along, when it just goes, say the wave's just turned over and it's got a little bit of white foam on the top. Sometimes if you have a trough or a gully or a hole, that wave then hits that deeper section and stops breaking. So if you look along the beach very quickly, you'd see a beach. I'm talking about a beach maybe with a hole or a couple of gullies, or a little channel maybe where that water's spilled out and created a little deeper section. When you watch that wave coming over, you're going to notice different sections where it's breaking, when it's not breaking. Now, when it's not breaking, you're going to find a deeper section, whether that be a hole or a gully or that kind of trough. Or if that wave comes over the bar and it's breaking and then it stops breaking, it's probably hit a deeper section. So that'd be my first clue, really. So look for clues that the waves are doing that are a little different. So, you look down that beach, look for the inconsistencies, look for the differences, look for it stops breaking, look for it, maybe it jacks up there's a bar, often a secondary bar kind of, 20, 30 meters off the beach along these beaches. And as it pops over that bar, it's going to enter deeper water. And we go back to that old idea of a wave needs a certain proportion of water to break. So a wave needs a depth of water proportionate to its height in order to break. So when it hits a deeper section of water, it's going to stop breaking. So that'd be my best advice, really, is to start looking for those differences in the waves. You can find like a kind of elevated view. So we've got some cool little bluffs and so on along some of these beaches. And a really good thing I do with clients is stand on top of that bluff and look at the kind of overall way the swell is breaking and the way the swell is interacting with the beach. And from there, we can get some really good clues about where the holes are, where that trough is, where those inner gullies are. And we can start to go down to that beach and then look at how the waves are behaving on a kind of eye level, because sometimes it's a lot harder to spot on an eye level. But if you looked at it from above and then got into an eye level, and even better would be, as you mentioned earlier, going to that beach when there's no tide at all, when it's at minus tide, like Nick mentioned, that minus 1 foot or whatever, you can really see those areas where you're going to be fishing over. And then you come back a bit later on and you look at how the water's interacting with that area, and you can log that into your mind. Say, okay, so when it hits a structure like that, the wave behaves like that. The next time you go to the beach and you see the wave behaving like that, you know that bit of structure underneath there. And if you catch a fish off that bit of structure, even better. Because then you know that you've got a format in your brain of, okay, so this bit of structure, this tide, this swell height, I know what that looks like. I know that holds fish. So really, that'd be my best advice. Do a bit of research, do a bit of scouting. Also look at those waves very carefully and look at how they relate to the structure, which you've already identified. And that'd be my best advice, really. But that's very much talking about how I do it kind of bait and weight style. Not so much bait and weight, but using like grubs and, sand crabs and so on. So I think Nick will definitely have some different ideas about how you might fish it with a lure orientated approach. So I'm very interested. So far away, Nick, I'm fascinated to hear this. So.
Yeah, so I want to reiterate a couple things. The first thing you talked about, where if you see the wave building and it has that white crest, and that crest disappears in some area, I always explain it like if a wave loses its crest or decrests in one specific spot, it drops off there, or possibly there's some raised up rocky area. But that's huge. The biggest thing to even take a step back from all that is if you're just starting out, and I think this takes us back to the first question we got about just what you're looking for in terms of where to cast. If you're just starting out and you don't know much about reading the surf or reading the water, however you want to call it, just look at the water, understand what looks like normal water, and if you see something that looks different than that, give it a cast. That's how you're going to start learning it. And when later on, when you have the time to go really scout a beach, it's awesome to show up at high tide, take your guesses. A lot of people say show up at low tide and figure it out and then fish it later. That's great. Show up at high tide, take your guesses, and then see. Sorry, that's my dog. see if you were right, because that's the most comprehensive way of learning. That's something that I don't think a lot of people talk about, and I think that's something everyone should try. The other thing Ben mentioned that's really important is to the raised areas like the bluffs we got. For instance, Black's Beach over in San Diego, I actually did a couple videos, one on reading the surf in general and one on fishing at Black's Beach, and I have this really cool shot where I actually went from above and looked at the angle from above, and you can see the exact huge hole that we're fishing, and it's a rip combined with a hole. And it's exactly what Ben was talking about with the decresting. So no crest, and that's the biggest thing. But the other things with the rocks, there's a different kind of, I guess, marking you'll see in the water when you're finding hard structure like that. And when a wave goes over a rock and then starts to pull back, you see kind of a ring form around the rock. And that's a really good indicator that there's a rock there. And you don't want to cast directly on the rock. You want to cast every side of the rock. And there's so many different things you could go into. Troughs, when the water pulls back, you'll see the water basically funnel into that trough and through it. The surface of the water is just a fuzzy mirror of what's below. And there's so much you can get into reading the surf. But the biggest thing, when you're starting out, cast where it's different. Just look where it's different, take guesses. That's the biggest, most important takeaway.
I completely agree, actually, Nick. That's a good point. Just looking where it's different is a good starting point, really, and going from there. I think actually the other thing I'd like to add to that is the type of structure I've actually found that is really holds fish so often for me is I call them riffles. And if you fished in the kind of like trout stream or maybe shallow rivers and so on, You might kind of know what I mean. This kind of like textured surface on the water. And I'm pretty sure what causes that most of the time, from what I've seen, is where you have like a bar or a kind of a raised section on a beach, and the water's flowing over that bar into deeper water. And the riffles occur in the deeper water, where the water is kind of rushing over that shallow section and then has to slow down a little bit or gets disrupted when it hits the slightly deeper section. And that deeper section always seems to hold fish, because the fish are staging there off that top, beside that bar with that water flowing over the top. Really, that's kind of food conveyor belt of those crabs and worms and all the little food items flowing over there, over that shallow water into that deeper section. And they're putting in, and the way another thing I like to say to clients is, the fish is going to want minimal effort, maximum food for minimal effort. So it's where you find somewhere to sit there and wait for food to come to it. And that's really a great spot to identify. And the best way to identify those is those riffles, those kind of very strangely textured, and often a kind of room-sized section of this kind of textured water right beside, adjacent to a kind of sandbar or a little section that's quite shallow. And that's the only thing I'd add to that. Is just look out for those ripples. And I thought it was very interesting about the rocks as well, Nick. Fishing the right types of rocks is not something I do a huge amount of. So, the more insight about that, the better, really. It's fascinating, particularly for those weirder surf perch that favour those kind of rockier outcrops. Mm-hmm. That's definitely going to be useful.
Yeah, and dude, to bounce off you called them riffles, right? So I'm looking at the article I did on that, and I refer to those as basically wind ripples, but they're not actually wind ripples. They're kind of fake wind ripples. They do. That's what it looks
really,
like.
Really windy in just one spot, doesn't it?
Yeah,
really
exactly. Windy. Yeah, totally follow what Ben just said, for sure.
Well, that makes sense. I think the main thing that we've learned here is that anything that's different should be targeted. Any sort of structure should be addressed and casted towards. There's just so much to approach when it comes to surf perch, and like Ben said, it's almost like collecting all the Pokemon. There's such a variety, and there's so many different techniques, and the real takeaway is just getting out there and giving it a shot and seeing what bites. That's the most fun, I think, with surf fishing. I don't do it very much myself, but I just watching people pull out. You have no idea what you're getting some of the times, and you guys would probably know that more than anybody. So let's kind of look forward for you guys. What's your next trip out there on the shore?
I'm not quite sure yet. We've got the lovely situation in Orange County of our beaches having just reopened. I haven't really been dialed into that kind of Orange County surf perch bite yet, because we haven't been able to fish for the last 2 months really until a few days ago. So I'm just looking forward to getting dialed back into that barred surf perch bite. I'm definitely going to be hitting it this weekend. So I'm going to get in the exact combo I mentioned earlier, getting a little bag of 2-inch grubs and a little paddle tail, kind of little motor oil grub type things, and just getting onto that bite, really working out what they're up to, seeing what kind of grade fish are home, because definitely as the season progresses, some points you're going to have these large amounts of very small fish, or maybe small amounts of the very large female fish. So kind of interested to see what's going on really, and seeing how that progresses really the next 2, 3, 4 months. And I think that's going to be very much my focus, to catch really just as many big giant hard surf perch as I can until the spring. One thing I'm really interested in, actually, reading Nick's article and reading some of Nick's material about using muscle meat. I think that's probably something very interesting, because I really haven't cracked using bait and weight tactics for perch in terms of pure, not just like bouncing a grub around, but just literally sitting it out there on like a 2-hook dropper rig or something. I've caught a few perch, but I feel like I should have caught more. So maybe I'm looking forward to getting my head around maybe targeting the bigger ones on things like muscle meat this winter, using maybe a few of those tactics as well. So that's it really from my perspective, just getting my head around that bite again. Maybe hopefully there'll be plenty of fish home. I don't think there's going to be any sand crabs home, so it's going to be definitely fishing with the grubs, bouncing those little grubs around. I really like using 4-pound fluorocarbon. I like the kind of extra challenge of landing the bigger fish on the lighter line. I think you get a few more hookups as well. Also this time of year, there's still an outside chance of things like corbina, spotfin croaker, things which are maybe a little bit more particular about the kind of grade of or the thickness of line that they bite on. So hedging my bets a little bit for the next month, but really early next year I'm going to be all out surf perch, 8-pound fluorocarbon leaders, 2-inch grubs, maybe chopped in half if I'm fishing for slightly smaller grade fish with clients. But definitely I really enjoy the kind of process in the winter of getting up at dawn, fishing for an hour or two. I'm pretty lucky. I live pretty close to the beach, and hitting that beach for an hour or two and coming back and getting work done, or then taking clients the next day or whatever. But yeah, so that's it really. Just looking forward to getting back onto that bite, catching loads of big barred surf perch this year, and just hopefully that water temperature stays decent. And that's it really. Just pretty stoked about the next few months after that kind of couple of months off. How about you, Nick? What are you up to? You still got a nice water temperature down there, haven't you? So I feel like you're gonna have a really good kind of really good few weeks with some maybe bigger grade fish, and hopefully there's females will be down by your way soon.
We're still in that 60 to 62 degree range is what the water temps are saying. I think it feels a little bit more like 63.
Yeah, I was going to say you skew ever so slightly warmer down there, don't you? So
yeah, but no, definitely. I mean, I'm going to be sticking to what I know. I'm going to be doing some Lucky Craft, and I'm going to be doing some muscle meat mainly. And I've been trying more and more swim baits, so that's a big one I'm trying to figure out. I actually just took a trip up to Santa Barbara and then down to Malibu and hooked up with a couple of guys who really know what they're doing in terms of targeting the bigger grade fish. But I just want to stress it. I mean, the thing about trying the lures and trying Lucky Crafts, it's a low percentage game. Winter is the time to do it because you're not going to be catching as much fish or as many fish as you'd catch in the summertime. And the bonus is you'll get the bigger fish, but you'll also, targeting surf perch in the right areas, you'll have a bonus halibut here and there. And I think that's one of the huge exciting parts about targeting bigger grade surf perch in general. There's always a bigger surprise. And the same thing is true for bait, but I think lure, the surprise is a little more surprising.
Nick, can I just ask you a question actually? Because I know there's a few different patterns of like Lucky Craft and similar kind of lures. Do you have any thoughts about colours and patterns? And I know there's for example, glow in the dark lures. There's also ones which is pure black. Do you have any preference? Like, what is your 1 or 2, 3 go-to surf perch lures this time of year?
So for surf perch specifically, it's going to be Lucky Craft. The swim baits don't really catch a whole lot of surf perch because they do have small mouths. Small mouths, even though their eyes are much bigger than their stomachs, they'll go for it. They just won't get hooked on a swim bait very often. But for Lucky Crafts, zebra sardine, you can't find it on a lot of places. And I know with a lot of Lucky Crafts, they're hit or miss wherever you go. But zebra sardine, you should be able to find it on Tackle Direct or Tackle Warehouse. Sometimes Amazon, but rarely. That's kind of my go-to for surf perch. And then I've found that pearl white for halibut. And a credit to my good buddy Kyle. He's helped me figure out a lot of it. It's always better and more productive fishing with 2 people. But halibut, pearl white specifically in that clear vis water and in that low light. And I found out a lot more with swim baits. Low light, go darker colors, and low vis. But the 2 that I will just regularly bounce back and forth between are pearl white and zebra sardine. And metallic sardine is great too. Caught plenty on metallic sardine, sexy smelt, anchovy, a couple others. But zebra sardine is a tough one to beat in general. That's actually what I got, surprisingly, my personal best halibut on as well, even though I've caught more halibut on the pearl white.
Very interesting. And just one last question as well, Nick. Do you catch many perch at night or in kind of real low light conditions on those lures? And would you change your pattern of lure to maybe a slightly more aggressive or standing out color in low light?
Definitely low light. I'm going to be using the zebra sardine. But mainly when I'm specifically targeting surf perch, I've actually found that you've got that really early morning bite, but sometimes it can be literally 1 or 2 fish. But I've found the most consistent time of day to catch the bite for surf perch, at least in the kind of November through spring section of the seasons, is like 10 a.m., like 9 to 11, which is weird. And my theory last year, I kind of developed this theory that, like, especially because last year we had really cold water temps in general, for whatever reason, I was just thinking, okay, maybe it's just way too cold. I know water temp doesn't fluctuate a whole lot, but it does fluctuate a little bit. Maybe it's just way too cold in the morning for them, and that surface water heats up a little bit as the sun comes out, and they're feeling a little more active around that 10 a.m., 11 a.m. time slot.
Yeah, maybe the bait and the kind of stuff they're feeding on is a little bit more active as well. Maybe
that's another idea. Yeah,
little bait fish are going to be sitting in the shallows a little happier. So there's a lot when I'm wading for dropping baits for like sharks and stuff. You see there's little shots of tiny little smelt that almost sunbathing on the bars. So yeah, maybe that might be a factor.
All right. Well, hey, I think everybody has a good primer here, and if somebody's a beginner, they can definitely have some takeaways from this conversation. Or if somebody's kind of a seasoned vet, I think just having this conversation and sharing the knowledge that you guys have has been useful for everybody. So I appreciate you guys joining the show. Do you have any kind of parting words for the audience today?
Yeah, no, nothing to add really, apart from just get out there. Just make sure you use the right stuff, because you're kind of messing yourself up if you try and use the trout rod you've had sitting in your garage for 20 years and which has got some wiry old mono on there. If you're trying to fish for kind of the style I've just kind of described. So just be a bit careful about the stuff you use. But apart from that, just get out there. If you're lucky craft guys, some of that stuff Nick's talked about is just absolute gold dust in my eyes. So that's it, really. Just get out there, enjoy the next few months perch fishing, because they're a fascinating, unique species on the west coast here. Really special fish, and like I said, there's 20 different ones, so there's always going to be something to go at. And understanding those is really a kind of lifetime's work in my eyes. So just get out there and enjoy it, really.
Well, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Western Outdoor News. And if you listen to the show, especially, hey, you listen to an hour conversation about surf perch fishing, you owe it to yourself to grab a subscription to Western Outdoor News and get the news delivered to your inbox or your mailbox every single week for only $39.95. And right now we've got a holiday special, so it's only $34.95. Jump over to wonews.com and grab yourself a subscription, and we'll see you next week.